Bore da. It is still Bore da. Happy Father's Day to those who are celebrating it. So thank you for joining us this Sunday morning. It's nice to see the sun is out in Bridgend, and I think it's out across the most of Wales. So this week we're going to be focusing on education, and I'm pleased to have two guests with us today who've got specific insight into education. So we have Rachel Garrick, who works in the energy industry and is a Labour County Councillor for the Caldicot Castle Ward on Monmouthshire County Council. Hello, Rachel.
Shemai, how are you doing?
Good. And we got Ty Golding as the head teacher of Halton Primary with 22 years of experience. You wouldn't be able to tell from looking at him. So he still looks like he's 21 as a teacher, and 16 years of that as an education leader, and he's been directly involved in education policy development in Wales. And myself, Hugh Marshall, I'm a former member of the National Digital Learning Council that I was on with Ty. I'm also school governor at primary secondary schools in Bridgend, and I'm on the board of Mudiad Meithrin. So before we start off, I just want to give you a quick introduction to Talking Wales. So here's a short video. We're building a community and we want you to be part of it. A news and information service designed to keep Welsh citizens informed, a space where issues that matter and impact our daily lives can be discussed, developing ideas and challenging those in power. Sharing news and information via digital radio, YouTube, social media and online, using clear, understandable language on the platforms you use most often. It'll be owned by you, our members, serving all of Wales and its people wherever they are in the world. Join us on our journey and help us create a better Wales. Thank you very much. So just to let you know, if you're watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube or X or Twitter as it was known, you can leave a comment and we'd love to hear from you, especially if you're working in education or a parent, or maybe you've just left education or maybe you're still in it. So we'll get on to the first subject. So obviously the focus for Talking Wales at the moment is the general election. Can I ask both of you then, are you surprised at the lack of attention that education has received so far? Rachel?
Well, yeah, I mean, saying that, obviously, as a Labour councillor, we're really clear that we do have it in the manifesto there, and it's always a challenge when it comes to the general election because education is devolved across the UK. So what you're seeing and what you're reading is essentially the plan that's going to be implemented in England, and then you'll see those Barnett formula consequences going through to Wales and the other devolved nations as well. So there's clearly education in the Labour manifesto, and they're talking about 6,000 new teachers across England, improving nursery education and doing the good things that we're doing here in Wales, looking at a curriculum review just like we did when we brought in curriculum for Wales, looking at those free school breakfasts, etc. But in terms of what people are looking for across the UK and what they're expecting, I'm quite surprised that education isn't up there, because it's not just for parents and young people. It's about the quality of education and what people go into the world with as adults, and that's got a huge bearing on what your society and your country looks like.
And I think it's quite interesting because I did some research before coming on, and basically the four top topics, all that the people want to discuss, right, or think that are important topics: health, the economy, the cost of living crisis, and immigration. So they all get, immigration is fourth, health is first, but they range between like sort of 20 and 25%. Education is only 10%, is about 8 on the list. And I remember going back a few years, it used to be much higher. So yeah, I think that's been a surprise. What about you, Ty? As somebody who works actually on the coalface, how have you just seen coverage of education as a topic?
I think, picking up really on what Rachel has said, I think for myself, particularly in depth, delving into sort of that Labour manifesto, really, covering those 5 areas. And I think key areas, I think what I'm surprised about more so is that there's a huge relevance, as Rachel said, between a lot of those strands, between sort of, UK wide or England centric education and the Welsh system. And I suppose I'm surprised about the lack of obvious selling and learning from what we've already experienced or learnt in Wales. I think that's the first point. Particularly a lack of links perhaps to the ambition that we've had in our system and the reforms that we've got going on through the wider paradigm change, which is, 2024 now, been going on since 2015 in Wales. It's not perfect, but we've got a huge amount of learning that's come out of that system, and there's a huge amount of links and sort of relationships with those sort of bullet points that as you work through that Labour manifesto. So the surprise for me is perhaps less so around reference to the Welsh system and the specifics, perhaps surprise around what intelligence and data has been gathered from our journey so far.
Yeah, and I think that sort of segues into sort of the next part of our discussion. So looking at education as a policy area, because as you mentioned, it's a wholly devolved competence. So when education is discussed by the main UK parties, does Wales and devolution get mentioned enough, if at all? Obviously, Wales funding comes from the block grant. And is affected by the Barnett formula. So I think it's fair to say, the likelihood is on the 4th of July, we're going to have a Labour government, or if by some miracle, a minority Conservative government. But I think, it's pretty sure that, Labour will be in power. So based on what their spending commitments for England in the manifesto, that would mean a consequential for Wales, which should see sort of a substantial increase in funding. Just to explain to people, so the block grant, based on whatever is devolved to Wales, so it's mainly health and education. Transport, I think, is about 70%, but basically whatever that spend in England is given to Wales on a per capita basis, and I think it's roughly about 15% more of what's spent in England because of the economic situation that Wales finds it in. We will do a session on the Barnett formula at some point, but it is something that a lot of people complain about, but it is something that impacts. So I think one thing that's quite interesting, again, if you're watching this now and you're a parent or or interested in education, is how actually education works. So Welsh government gets the money from the UK government. They then get to decide how much of that block grant is spent on education. So as I said, it's mainly health, mainly education. So with more money coming through potentially, what sort of impact do you think that could have in Wales? And will that be, sort of better, more spending on schools, or is it just going to be sort of filling, the hole that's sort of developed over the last sort of 10, 15 years? So Ty, what do you think? What, from a, if you're getting more money for your school, what would you like to see?
I think it's really simple, and unfortunately, I'm going to oversimplify it. I think first and foremost, it's staffing, and we're not just talking about staffing as a numerical resource, but staffing as a quality and a professional resource. So with that staffing, needs to come high quality professional learning. It needs to become and be delivered alongside opportunities to collaborate and network in a highly professional way, and communicate across the system and share that system knowledge. It's about good old-fashioned resources, Hugh. Making sure we've got high access and access to sort of high quality, if you like, visits, the physical resources in the classroom, and amongst all of that, I suppose a primary resource and something of particular interest to myself is the environmental resource we've got in Wales as well, because we've got quite an old property stock in Wales, hugely Victorian driven across our schools in Wales. And whilst there's a huge set of romantic rose-tinted spectacles looking at our Victorian buildings. They equally do come with some roller coasters of experiences. And having worked in, both Victorian schools and brand new 21st century school builds, there's pros and cons to both. But I think it's about making sure that we've got that equity across the system.
And Rachel, as somebody, obviously, as a county councillor, you're involved in sort of day-to-day decisions around the funding of schools in Monmouthshire. How does that, just explain to people, how does that relationship work with Welsh Government and the funding you receive, and then how you decide that money is spent on a county level?
So principally, you're looking at your revenue support grant that comes through from Welsh Government to the county as the local authority, and then that's not split up saying thou shalt spend X on education, Y on social care. That's in the domain of the local authority to determine that, and we do that every year. In terms of the individual schools allocation, what we do there is consult with the schools themselves, and obviously you try very hard to provide the schools with the budget they need, but I think we're all aware that there was a significant shortfall in Welsh Government's budget this year, and every council has shortfalls as well. What you were seeing this year is you've got a limited budget, but you've got a very appropriate pay rise for teachers. So you've got a large wage bill increase to cover, as well as all the other rising costs associated with the schools as well. So essentially, whilst you're seeing an increase in school budgets, it's difficult to plug that gap, and consequently we're seeing across most counties in Wales that loss of staff. And like Ty said, you're looking at how many staff you've got and the need for quality staff. You need to be having mid and career level professionals working in the schools as well, and that can be challenging when those are more expensive.
I think again, I'm speaking just as a school government as well. So I'm aware in Bridgend County where we are, lots of schools are facing a deficit next year, and as Ty mentioned, staffing is a big thing. So for I think majority primary school staffing is over 90% of the school budget. So if you are looking to make any savings of any note, it has to be from a staff perspective. But I'm quite interested, Ty. So from your perspective as somebody who's running a school, do you see, especially post-COVID, because there's talk now of statistically we've seen a peak now in primary numbers, that numbers are going to start falling because of just the way the population, the baby boom is going down. So there's thoughts of, well, there's going to be less pupils. But do you think that, is that a case of schools, well, great, we're going to have smaller classes, we're going to be able to save money that way? Or are you seeing challenges in different areas around sort of, the needs of children?
I think it's quite an apt question there, Hugh, and I think it's something that perhaps is a bit of a misnomer in the system, that we'll have greater flexibility financially. And I think, you talked about seeing or potentially seeing numbers drop. We're already, particularly in my area, my cluster of schools, seeing significant drops around that kind of nursery reception year one age. And no doubt that bubble will sort of translate right through the system in the next 3 to 4 years. But in particular, I think what's happening is I think there is a growing need. Whether it's post-COVID or not, Hugh, I'm probably not inclined to sort of pin my colours there, because I would imagine, and having read quite widely on this, I would imagine that we were already seeing trends of challenge prior to COVID. I think, in my own experience and my own opinion, a little bit of a tin pot theory perhaps here, but I think COVID accelerated and exacerbated a lot of challenges, and I think it promoted them to the surface. So whilst not sort of distinctly COVID related, everybody's experiences were hugely different through that. But what I am seeing in school is, numbers are falling, but the needs of individuals, and particularly around sort of well-being, mental health, emotional, social needs, which in itself I think are actually symptoms of a wider community and a social need. I don't think they're unrelated. And particularly in our school as well, the need and the challenge that comes with meeting the need to support families, parents, and wider community facilities. And I think front and centre in communities such as my own, I think you find the school, and you find those good schools putting themselves, perhaps back to the centre of where they were traditionally. I think there's a whole other conversation in that. But yes, I think numbers are falling, but I think particular needs, and it's very easy to throw away this anecdotally, uh, but particular needs of learners coming through are increasing, and I think it's testament to the schools and the staff and what we've got going on in our education system, that even with sort of diminishing resource, schools are not just surviving in Wales, but many schools are thriving. So, and I think that's huge testament. But I think perhaps also at certain stages we are too successful in that means.
Rachel, I see you nodding in agreement there.
Yeah, I think you got to go back to that funding piece as well, where you've got those accelerated and increased needs, but actually your funding is so tight, it's difficult to provide the support professionals that you need for it as well. And that's a challenge. I think we're all familiar with longer waiting times for educational psychology support, etc. And yeah, going again back to the whole funding, it's quite positive to see that recognised in the Labour Party manifesto and the intention to increase that, and hopefully that will mean a trickle through of funding for Wales as well.
And I think what's interesting as well, because we talk about the cost of living crisis, and it is sort of that and health are the two main issues that people talk about this general election. But I think it's fair to say in many communities across Wales, there's been a cost of living crisis for the last 20 years. So yes, more people are being impacted, but I think we seem to forget about people. 1 in 3 kids in Wales, living in poverty. It's 1 in 2 in some wards, and again, that pressure is placed on schools to for that part of for their care. So how do you think that sort of that financial pressure just on a day-to-day basis impacts things, Ty?
Well, I think what you've got is a limited amount of people to do a growing task. I think that's the simple sort of reflection on it. I think for us in our school and in particularly in my cluster of schools, I think the answer's been pretty simple, really, and success achieved through, if you went for a better phrase, but economies of scale, collaboration. I think particular challenges you see in schools where there is the deprivation you talk about, Hugh, are getting the learners front and centre. First and foremost is getting them in a position that they're able to access school, and I think that sounds and can be sort of bounced back really as a trite statement, but we need to get them in a position that they can come to school. We need to get them to school when they are in school. When they're in school, we need to get them into emotional and a ready position that they can engage in learning in a meaningful way. And then we need to make sure that all of that support and that learning and the well-being that we're putting in place is also perpetuated out into the wider community too. So I think and as I said, schools, I genuinely believe schools are front line and front and center in communities at the moment. So the challenge really around having to meet all of that and try and bridge that gap, obviously again comes down to resource. But equally so, I'm not one that perhaps would sit behind the resource as an excuse, and I think we need to be thinking slightly different into what does it mean to run a school? What does it mean to run a school in Wales? Particularly, what does it mean to run a school in the context of all of our communities? And those contexts in Wales, as you both would probably quite rightly know, they're hugely different. There's a huge variation in context in the local authority where I both live and work. And I think it's important that we and schools are allowed to be able to address that and have the flexibility and the support to address the need. And whether we like to admit it or not, schools in areas where there are challenge, where there are socioeconomic challenges, albeit we'll inevitably have to work that degree harder in order to be able to get those learners in the classroom ready to learn and support. It's not a carte blanche thing, but it's a reality. And I think, in all honesty, a lot of our schools in Wales have done that and continue to do that superbly well. Before, as Rachel said, before COVID, during COVID in particular, I thought the response, and from my experience I was picking up nationally for schools, was excellent and superb. And I think we did very well nationally on that. And then post COVID, I think we're in a landscape here where that struggle and that challenge continues to rise, and we need to make sure that we don't impact upon that. The system's held together by goodwill. We don't impact upon the kind of formal and informal processes that keep our schools going in the communities.
Yeah, and as somebody, again, Rachel, as a county councillor, is that something that you see as a council, sort of running a council, that has an impact, obviously on schools, but also just on the wider communities and economy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's Monmouthshire, so it doesn't quite have the same levels of need in a lot of areas that you'll see in some parts of Wales. My experience growing up was going to school in a regeneration area and seeing a school there that was incredibly good at putting their pupils front and centre in the 80s, which were equally as hard. And it was about the children and it was about the learners, and they did some fantastic things. We've got a huge amount of experience in Wales of doing this. We've been doing it throughout the valleys for decades now. But yeah, where you've got a school that is part of the community, and the whole new schools programme that we're building across Wales is about putting those schools as part of the community as well as just being new schools buildings. And where you're getting that, you're seeing much more benefit than just you've got a good school. You're improving the community as well and bringing it together.
Yeah.
It's about that value added, Rachel, isn't it?
Yeah.
That school brings, and I'm not one who would ever overlook the huge responsibility and an honor of being able to work and deliver high quality learning and education to those learners as well, because we need to face the fact that the good quality learning and that academic journey that we can provide in schools in Wales, I think in particular, it's a passport. And it's a passport onto those children having improved life chances and improved success. But equally so, we all need to be mindful that perhaps some of the foundation that sits below that we can't build that on a sand. And it's really important that that community focused schools work that you talked about then is really addressed. And if we're talking and going back to the Barnet consequential there you talked about earlier, Hugh, and Rachel has talked very much about how the distribution works at that local authority level, is we can't neglect the fact that some schools are going to need to work harder or work wider on those issues in order to be able to have as equal and as fair a chance as you can.
So it's fair to, again, and I think this is the issue, is there's no one size fits all, because as Rachel mentioned, you're going to have, certain areas are going to be more affluent, you're going to have certain areas that are going to have more levels of sort of social deprivation, and it is a challenge then to try and sort of come up with a plan that's going to sort of work for all. So I think, just moving on now, just thinking sort of Ty, what would you say is, what is the current state of education in Wales? Can you explain a little bit about the curriculum reform and what that actually means?
Yeah, thank you. We've got a new curriculum in Wales, and I'm sort of loath to call it a new curriculum now. It's been sort of growing and evolving since 2015, but it's an easier way for listeners to grasp it outside of education, and that pretty much has moved away from a system which very much was sold and presented as being very high accountability, very much around centralized control and centralized diktat, and what it has done, and I think the most important thing that the curriculum has done, alongside with a few others, is the fact that it does put it in the hands of school leaders and teachers to the respect of, if you like, context-based agency. I think is probably the best way to consider that. And whilst we have a national framework, there's no getting away from the fact that we need a metric or a nationalized standard in order to be able to develop and have that consistency and quality assurance around Wales. But having sort of been a head teacher now under the new curriculum in two very different schools, what it has done, it's allowed me to have that flexivity and reflexivity, if you like, to be able to respond to the needs of my community. But first and foremost, and we ask in our school is, what are the needs and what do these children need to be able to know, be able to do and be able to have experienced by the time they move on and leave us, in order that they're best ready for the next stage in education, but equally so in order for them to be able to and have an appreciation, if you like, and a payback from our education system. So that's where it's put. Behind all of that, it's a purpose-driven sort of concept-driven curriculum, which allows, and it's the kind of technicality of that purpose-driven that allows that degree of flexibility for us. And then the landscape in Wales really is that we are starting to see the accountability system taking greater shape, and it's been slow to come. However, the understanding and going forward, and what I would probably like to see is a greater accountability around networking and collaboration of schools working together. Because I think if we are, open and honest and reflective about where we're going resource financially, and meeting those needs of those communities, I think there's probably very little that schools could be as successful on their own as they could be working with other schools. So that's where we are with the system. We've got local authorities working hugely, productively and very hard to work with their schools and their health service provisions, and make sure that we're meeting the needs, and there's cooperation and collaboration on there. Wales is also set up, Hugh, into clusters, if you like, 4 clusters of local authorities on an education school improvement front, and 4 regional consortia, who then take sort of a dual responsibility. Firstly, the responsibility provided to them and afforded to them by the local authorities to work on school improvement and support schools on school improvement, and then on the other front, really on sort of a Welsh government remit to deliver high quality professional learning and support the profession. And that's hugely variable, and that's the model. The reality really at the moment that we see is that there's a slight attritional sort of devolution of those regional consortia at the moment, and we're in a landscape of probably at the moment of the unknown, and we're not quite sure where that sort of tension and dynamic between local authority and regional consortia sits currently or will sit going forward into the future. But I have no answer for that, and no, there's no easy solution to education at all. And if you look at the manifesto, particularly the Labour manifesto that I've been reading through lately, there's quite a strong line in there about exploring regional working and regional school improvement. And I think that's particularly relevant to my first point when we opened this is, wouldn't it be interesting if that wasn't just a throwaway statement and actually there was learning for English colleagues and the English education system, which is a very different landscape to Wales, hugely different. Wouldn't there be benefit in learning and cross contamination, if you like, on that front? And I actually ended up at one stage going through a number of the party manifestos, some not very different in statement to intent from what we currently have over the border there. But what was surprising was the number of points that I highlighted that either we'd done, we were doing, or we were intending to do in Wales, with very little of that sort of relational dynamic.
And I think just on that point, we've launched, Talking Wales has launched a voter tool. If you visit Talking Wales, the website talking.wales, you can click on there, and that is in the process of being updated. But basically, it's taken the key elements of each party's manifestos, and will then, you go through a questionnaire, and it'll tell you, which party aligns most with what you think. And it is quite interesting. It's currently based on the 2019 manifestos until it's updated with the new ones. And it is worth actually visiting it now and looking at that to see how policy has evolved, and changed over those 5 years. But picking up on what Ty was saying there, sort of Rachel, so do you see from a local authority point of view, getting schools to work together, and obviously sort of local authorities got a big role in that, as the people who sort of, you've got director of education and an education department within each local authority. How do you think, seeing, new ways of working, is that something that Wales basically, we should be leading the way with?
Oh, I think it's very much so. Over here in Monmouthshire, we're using the cluster approach for schools, and you are seeing at primary level that integration between the schools. So you're seeing head teachers working together. You're seeing the different schools going to their main clusters, sharing their best practice and looking to implement that as well. So yeah, it's an excellent model. You can, it's very easy to put yourself in a silo and work in the sort of boundaries of your organization, and schools are as vulnerable to that as any organization. So the ability to look and share and see what works for you, see what works for others, and take that back to your school is incredibly important. It's that whole continuous improvement piece that allows you to keep on going and see what works. And you don't have to take a chance on implementing something that might work that you've read about. You can go to your cluster and discuss what's happening, how it's been done, take those lessons and know what you're anticipating, what you're expecting, and how you can go about implementing as well.
Yeah, and I think I think you raise an interesting point there, and again, and Ty, you're talking about how do we work collaboratively and learn from each other, and I think that that is something that a lot of people. Do you think it's an issue in Wales that we have we have 27 local authorities? Do we have too many local authorities? But would is the consortia having four? I think it's North, Mid, West, and Southeast. Is it the four consortia? Do they sort of give an example then, or do they share that learning within their consortia, for example? It'd be interesting, just does that happen?
Yeah, without getting drawn into an arm wrestle, Hugh, nice try. I think, to be honest, I think it comes back to a previous point I think Rachel and I have both made. Wales is, it's a hugely diverse nation. It's a small country. It's difficult to travel from north to south and south to north, east to west, west to east. But the landscape, particularly educationally, is different. That's not a get out of jail card for any lack of coherence or consistency or demands that need to be placed on the system. But I think in terms of local authority, as is in terms of schools, I think they are hugely contextual. And I think Rachel has brought up the fact that her authority is, hugely different to my own. And within my authority, and I imagine, much as it is in schools, we hear the old adage in schools all the time that in-school variation is larger than school to school. And I would imagine that in-authority variation can also be as large, if not bigger, than between authorities. So whilst it might not sound great when you write it down as a black and white number, zeros and ones, 27, and whilst it might be difficult to get alignment across 27 across Wales, I also sometimes wonder whether that brings into itself a greater sense of agency, a greater sense of rebuttal and challenge, and actually a greater sense of being able to meet the contextual needs of communities. So I don't know is the answer, and I'm not commenting is the answer, but equally so, I would imagine that context is king, isn't it?
I think the point I was trying to make, maybe rather clumsily, was obviously from a consortia perspective, there are members of each local authority within that consortia there. What I'm trying to get at is, is there that sharing of knowledge of between what's happening in different authorities? So there's a framework there, and is that something that could be built on?
Yeah, you're right. I think that knowledge exchange across the system is vital. I think beyond that, actually, we've got a really good driver in the Welsh education system built around Welsh Government's work, if you like, on around schools as learning organisations. And I think that's hugely important. And for anyone who's interested in that model, it's worth looking into how that works. But I think the regional relationship of encouraging cross local authority working has no doubt had an impact, because it's opened up doors and it's opened up relationships. Equally so, I'm sure there are also schools and clusters and networks and local authorities that would work and inevitably work and have relationships outside of that as well. So I think, again, it's a very difficult one to say that certain successes of collaboration or knowledge exchange around the system is particularly due to any effect or any particular behaviors that we've had. And I think it comes down to, Hugh, in my experience, a lot of it comes down to personality of schools, personality of school leaders, if you like, personality and need of community. And it's something that I've always done before we had regional consortia, and will probably something I always do long after we've had them.
Yeah, I think one thing's coming through clearly from this conversation is your passion as well for education. And for me, and being involved in schools, I'm very fortunate to be involved in schools where we have a lot of passion in the school leadership, and I think that's something that maybe doesn't get sort of recognised as much. So just thinking now, sort of the situation with education, in Wales now. We've discussed about the curriculum and how that is there's an ongoing process, and how that is sort of having an effect in Wales. So it's saying 5 years time, when we're having this conversation ahead of the next general election, where would you like to see sort of Wales? Rachel, I come to you first.
No pressure, Rachel.
It's really none whatsoever. But it's really easy, isn't it? You want us to be leading in the UK, in Europe, as a modern, progressive education system that does put its learners front and centre and gets the results for those learners as well. And that's where it is for me. We've got the curriculum for Wales. We've got the vision. It's now the point where we progress and we get to that point of excellence as well.
And before I go to Ty, so Rachel, just thinking, the line of work you're in, you work in renewable energy, nuclear energy. So those are, they're the industries of the now, but also the future. Are you seeing, from your work perspective, are young people in Wales being equipped with the tools to work in that industry, or is there work that needs to be done there, do you think?
Well, I sort of remember sort of like certain nuclear new build site that I visited frequently. I'd say every third voice on that site at one point was Welsh. We are seeing a lot of Welsh voices across these industries. I think as a culture, we look to those hard engineering industries as good career options throughout Wales, and you do see that. But what we do see, and this isn't a Welsh thing, this is a UK thing, is it's actually really hard to get those professionals out of university and into the industry. And I think there's a feeling that people think they can't, but they can. And seeing more graduates and more sort of new professionals coming into the industries is incredibly important. And that's the vision that we need to set out. So if we talk about energy in the manifestos, I think most parties have got something in the manifestos around energy and climate change. We need that vision to understand that it's not just about what we're putting into those industries, it's what we're putting into the higher education as well, and the tertiary education, so people are choosing those industries as a career as well. Sorry, you got me on my soapbox there, Hugh.
So before you give us your vision of where in 5 years time, just picking up on what Rachel says there, it's we talk about the education continuum from primary, secondary, further and higher education. Is that something that you think looking at from the, because I think that's one of the things the curriculum of Wales are trying to address as well, isn't it? Is having that continuum and developing those skills, because at the end of the day, the economic growth and development is going to rely on developing people to work in those ways. How do you think that is working at the moment? And is it something that you discuss with colleagues in sort of higher education and secondary?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And you're quite right to point that out, and something that was slightly remiss of me earlier, really, when we talked about curriculum, that it's a 3 to 16 ambition, really. And I think the failures of previous systems, that we've been all too readily to chunk it up into silos, as Rachel talked about, you know, the pitfalls of silo working in any shape. And I think the 3 to 16 ambition is honourable. I think it is admirable. I think it's hugely ambitious. And I think that the system itself needs support in order to achieve that. And purely, in my experience, down to systemic behaviour drivers within education, because, you know, traditionally accountability has driven education. And it's a performative system, as you know, quite rightly, some people will argue it should be. However, what we've got is, and what we could end up with very quickly, is a dissonance between, as you said, the sort of early years, primary, and then secondary sectors, with having different drivers and different priorities. And I think if we end up, or we continue to allow that to happen in the system, we will naturally see the pendulum swing from any ambition of coherence going back to what could be a return to a fractured state in that sense. And I think you just need to be very careful about that. And something that, you know, over the years we've had in Wales is I think we've had very good policy intent, Hugh, if I'm honest. And I think we've had really honest and open policy ambition. And I've said it a few times, I think we trip up on implementation very often, but for a huge range of reasons. But equally so reasons that perhaps we need to start listening to our own lessons and learning from the past, and pushing ourselves forward. And I've talked about those over the border listening and heeding what we've done. I think perhaps we need to listen ourselves as well a little bit more. And it brings me on to sort of perhaps what you've just asked Rachel as well. I'm currently doing my doctoral research, and that's pretty much based around, if you like, in the simplest terms, of how leaders within the system translate national policy into practice in schools. So if I may, in answer to your question of where I want to see us, I'd like to pick that up both at a sort of national front, if you like, and at a local level. And for me, I think picking up on what Rachel has said is, you know, about her saying that we need to be successful, we need to be performing. I think we need to be really intelligent and a little bit more adaptively intelligent around what we measure in Wales. I think we need to be careful about getting pulled too far into investment and education direction based upon national and international measures. I think, you know, knee-jerk reactions will only prove negative for the system. I think there's a maturity that needs to happen across our system with regards to open, honest dialogue and debate. And I think we need to move away from any unhelpful paradoxes or dichotomies that could be and have formed over the border that are starting to sort of burgeon across our education landscape. Last year I was fortunate enough to go to Singapore, Hugh, and have a look at, you know, at their education system, work with some education leaders out there, school leaders, and even have conversation with ministers. And what really struck me, hugely different systems, hugely different history, hugely different drivers. That's a given. But one thing that hasn't left me really is the abundance of national clarity. Whoever I spoke to in Singapore, be they in education or out of education, could tell me why they were educating Singaporean learners. Now, that was mind-blowing for me and my colleagues. Now, whilst I didn't necessarily agree completely and wholesalely with the why, what I did like is the how and the what around how you actually, you know, if you like, how you get that collective efficacy together nationally around education. And in Singapore, it's changing slightly, but traditionally it's about economy. Education fuels economy. Now, you know, there's been clarity of that. Singapore's had huge successes, as have other nations around the world in that, but now they're also needing to realize that a change of lanes is a must in order to stay competitive globally. So for me, nationally, I think, you know, getting to the point in the end is perhaps less noise in the system, less priorities, less conflicting priorities, and a more of a national clarity around probably something that's a bit more succinct that myself and my colleagues can get behind. So at a national level, I think that's the priority. Something that's sort of emerged from some early research and lit review work that I'm doing as well is I landed upon in some pilot research work I landed upon 4 outcomes of how schools potentially could be successful in translating a national policy agenda into practice, and they were easily sort of addressed, I would say, at the national level. perhaps not being so at the moment. So it's leadership for change. So we need to really, really empower, and I mean that through training, through education, through agency, our school leaders to be able to react to what their communities need. But also, we also need to hold them to account at a national level as to what they're producing in their schools. We need to develop purposeful professional relationships in schools. So that's both in organisation and inter-organisation. We need to really harness then a sort of build on from that powerful professional networks, collaboration and cohesion across the system. And ultimately, we need hugely beneficial and productive tiers of professional learning through the system. And we need a national agenda on that. We need a local agenda, and then we need a very community-based agenda on that, and how that all ties together.
Yeah. And Rachel, I can see you clapping there. Would you like to, as we're just coming to the end now, is there anything you'd like to add to what Ty just said?
I think just that I support that completely. It's bang on, and yeah, simplicity is key. But yeah, having that tied up tiers of focus is so important.
Well, hopefully we'll get you back in 5 years' time, God willing. But definitely, I think it'd be worth picking up this conversation, in 6 months' time, and having this conversation on a regular basis, because I think one of the good things, about Welsh Government is, they are responding, and they do, listen to people. I think that's something that's worth mentioning. Through things like the, in this previous initiatives like the Digital Learning Council, but the fact that people like Ty, and I know of other school leaders who were on secondment with the Welsh Government, who are looking at how we can improve things. So there's definitely a will there, and I think it's one of those things that it cuts across the political spectrum as well. There's support from all parties for education in Wales. So on that note, thank you very much, Ty Golding and Rachel Garrick. And hopefully you can join us next week at 11 o'clock, when we'll be looking at the general election in Wales as we get closer to voting day. Thank you very much, both.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Hugh. Diolch, Rachel.
Diolch.
Hwyl
Thanks for
fawr.
having us. Hwyl fawr.